Opening the center pawn grants immediate influence over crucial central squares and prepares rapid development. Immediately contesting the center establishes a symmetrical pawn structure, creating a solid foundation for piece development and an equal game. Developing the knight naturally prepares for castling and eyes central squares. Developing the knight towards the center solidifies black's central presence and prepares for a balanced game. Challenging black's central pawn establishes immediate tension and opens aggressive possibilities on the queen side. Solidifying the d5 pawn creates a formidable Slav structure, preparing for a quiet positional battle. Clearing the center opens lines for rapid piece development and potentially a queenside pawn storm. A solid recapture, establishing central symmetry and maintaining piece development momentum. Developing a knight to its most natural square, the move subtly prepares to contest central control and supports a potential pawn push. Developing the knight towards the center strengthens black's pawn chain and prepares for queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this piece immediately stakes a claim on the critical e5 square, potentially pressuring black's central pawn structure and preparing for further queenside expansion. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this commitment to a more robust pawn structure embraces a slightly more passive, yet stable, path for black, aiming for harmonious piece placement rather than immediate central disruption. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, white aims for a classical setup, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and potentially challenge black's queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to a square that supports potential pawn advances in the center and prepares for kingside castling, this natural repositioning creates a solid defensive structure while eyeing the queenside for future activity. Developing the bishop to the active d3 square prepares to castle kingside while simultaneously placing pressure along the c2-g6 diagonal, hinting at a potential kingside attack should black be careless with their pawn structure. Securing the king is paramount, and this natural development efficiently tucks away your monarch behind a growing pawn wall, preparing for midfield struggles while maintaining active piece play. Preventing kingside expansion and maintaining pawn structure integrity is the aim here, a sensible, albeit passive, prophylactic measure. White secures the bishop on f4 and prepares for potential kingside play later, though it does cede some central dynamism for now. Preparing to connect the rooks and bolster the kingside defense, this knight maneuver subtly improves piece coordination while keeping options open for a future queenside expansion. The king's safety is paramount, and castling here secures the monarch while connecting the rooks for potential action. This quiet maneuver prepares for the upcoming middle game skirmishes and allows the previously somewhat passive king's rook to join the fray. It demonstrates a commitment to developing all pieces and reinforcing defensive structures before initiating offensive operations. Preparing to expand on the queenside, this maneuver aims to control the b5 square and potentially initiate a pawn lever with b5, aiming for queenside space. It also subtly prepares the knight's retreat to b8 should the d5 pawn ever become a target requiring defensive support. Asserting dominion over the c-file, the rook now stands ready to challenge black's pawn structure, hinting at potential advances or the creation of an open highway for an endgame assault should the central tension dissipate. Bringing the bishop to e8 prepares its redeployment to g6, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the knight, while also freeing the d-file for potential rook activity. Clearing the b1 square unlocks the c1 rook for potential action on the c-file, while simultaneously repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's queenside. Abandoning the central knight creates an immediate risk of positional concession, potentially sacrificing valuable central influence for unclear attacking prospects. Assess if the knight can truly become a potent force on the queenside, or if it's simply being driven from its more natural squares without adequate compensation, considering that black's pawn structure remains solid but lacks dynamic counterplay. Preparing to redeploy the bishop, white aims to shift its defensive influence from the c1-h6 diagonal to a more proactive role, potentially targeting the kingside or reinforcing the queenside pawn structure with timely support. Initiating a kingside pawn thrust signals a decisive shift in black's strategy, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable development and potentially launch an assault on the king's defenses. This pawn break, while creating dynamic possibilities, also introduces potential weaknesses and requires careful calculation to ensure the king remains secure. The resulting pawn structure could lead to complex tactical skirmishes, so awareness of piece activity and king safety is paramount. The knight's journey to the edge of the board on a4 aims to challenge black's control of the queenside, specifically eyeing the c5 square and potentially creating a blockade that cramps black's development. Reclaiming the central initiative, the bishop repositions, seeking active squares and preparing for potential pawn advances or even a daring sortie on the kingside, aiming to unbalance the otherwise solid but somewhat passive pawn structure. Filing the knight to c5, white proactively challenges black's bishop on d6, aiming to disrupt its defensive post and seize control of key central squares, potentially opening lines for future attacks. Sacrificing the bishop to eliminate white's active knight opens crucial diagonal lines for black's queen and rook, creating immediate pressure on the kingside and disrupting white's defensive setup. Securing the outpost on the kingside for the knight, white aims to disrupt black's queenside development and potentially create attacking chances. The recapture opens up the h-file, which might become a target for white's rook later, and grants the knight a more active role, potentially eyeing squares like g4 or f3 to support an eventual kingside pawn storm or simply to harass black's pieces. This exchange simplifies the position slightly, moving the game away from the complex pawn chains and towards a more piece-oriented struggle where initiative and tactical precision will be paramount. Black must now consider how to best utilize the newly freed bishop and prevent white's knight from becoming a dominant force in their territory. Preparing to redeploy the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn advances or defending against future kingside threats as the position opens. Targeting the queenside by placing the queen on this diagonal significantly increases pressure, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's recent pawn advances and piece maneuvering. Reasserting presence on the 7th rank, the rook now eyes the queenside, preparing to support a potential pawn push or to redeploy to a more active file should the opportunity arise. Unleashing a pawn storm, white seeks to disrupt black's seemingly serene position and exploit the diagonal that has opened up for the bishop. Opening a diagonal for the queen to probe the kingside, this capture creates a sharp, immediate tactical confrontation where king's safety becomes paramount. Opening the h-file immediately invites counterplay. While the passed pawn on g4 offers immediate territory, it also creates weaknesses around the king, demanding vigilance. Harnessing the power of the open g-file for attacking potential, black strategically repositions their knight to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs and offering defense against white's encroaching pieces. Unleashing the f-pawn injects immediate dynamism into the kingside, aggressively challenging black's pawn structure and aiming to pry open lines for white's pieces. Challenging the central pawn chain with a pawn lever on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's solid structure and gain more breathing room for his pieces, particularly the banished knight. This maneuver could open the b-file for potential infiltration or create a passed pawn if exchanges occur favorably. Seizing the queenside pawn immediately, white opens up lines and aims to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement. This aggressive capture is likely intended to create immediate pressure and possibly force concessions from black, who will have to spend time recovering the material or defending against white's encroaching pieces. The underlying idea is to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially isolate the rook on f7. Threatening the queen directly, black immediately forces a reorganization of white's pieces, potentially disrupting their queen's defense and creating opportunities for counterplay along the open b-file. Suddenly, the queens have locked eyes across the chessboard, initiating a dangerous game of capture and counter-capture that will undoubtedly shake up the pawn structure and open new avenues of attack. White's decision to snatch the rook pawn seems bold, but it leaves the queen somewhat exposed to potential threats from black's bishop and knight, while simultaneously inviting a counter-exchange that could benefit Black's king's safety. This aggressive capture might aim to disrupt Black's coordination, but vigilance is paramount as the board now teems with immediate tactical possibilities and potential for rapid material swings. This pawn thrust, 22, e5, explodes into the center, aiming to dismantle White's queenside advantage and open lines for Black's pieces. It seizes the initiative, forcing White to confront immediate tactical realities rather than continuing with their positional buildup. Black's rook on b8, no longer passively defending, now joins the fray through this bold central action. A sharp pivot to dismantle Black's pawn structure, forcing an immediate reckoning for the exposed king. Black recaptures the pawn, liberating the knight and unleashing it into the center, creating immediate complications around White's exposed queen and disrupting White's previously secure pawn chain. Striking at the heart of Black's weakened pawn structure, this capture seizes initiative and disrupts any cohesive defensive setup, forcing Black to react and potentially exposing their king's safety due to the compromised central squares. The unleashed knight, finally finding refuge on the queenside, now eyes the vulnerable pawn chain, creating immediate tactical possibilities and potentially liberating Black's queenside majority. A bold reorientation of the queen, seeking immediate disruption on the kingside while offering a tantalizing sacrifice of material for initiative. This gambit of sorts aims to exploit the slight awkwardness of Black's knight and open lines near the exposed Black monarch. A sudden royal check, seeking to disrupt White's centralized queen and potentially open lines towards the king, injecting vital dynamism into the position. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. The king retreats from the immediate danger zone, preparing for potential knight incursions and opening a subtle escape route along the first rank. A bold gambit to open a diagonal for your queen and disrupt White's pawn structure, daring them to seize material at the cost of piece activity and king's safety. Securing the compromised rook and solidifying control over the crucial central file, a defensive maneuver to shore up the king's weakened defenses after the dramatic exchange of material. The rook's redeployment to the now open file, having successfully lured White's queen to the queenside, sets up a fascinating positional struggle where Black seeks to activate pieces and exploit the slight disarray in White's pawn structure, especially after the exchange on d5. The immediate danger to the Black king seems to dissipate as this rook abandons its defense of the g4 pawn, perhaps aiming to reclaim central influence or prepare for an aggressive kingside venture. But it risks leaving the White king somewhat exposed to the bishop's current diagonal and the rook's potential infiltration on the 7th rank. Suddenly, the queen thrusts deep into the enemy's territory, a bold maneuver seeking to exploit the newly opened diagonals and disrupt White's defensive structure. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust aims to shatter the defensive structure around Black's king, opening lines for immediate threats after sacrificing material earlier. A bold thrust, aiming to exploit the open diagonal and disrupt White's king's safety, yet it walks into a tactical snare by exposing the knight to immediate danger and potentially sacrificing crucial central control. Pushing the g-pawn here unravels the kingside and creates immediate attacking possibilities, but at the cost of the pawn's own safety and potentially opening lines for Black's pieces. White is essentially gambling on a rapid assault to compensate for the positional concessions and the newly exposed monarchy. Unleashing a pawn torrent, Black bravely confronts the immediate danger, creating a complex tactical web where the White king's previously safe haven now appears exposed. Finally confronting the encroaching knight with a capture, White aims to disrupt Black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the Black king.